That summer remains the most memorable of my life, filled with an unexpected excitement. It began as a simple escape from the oppressive heat, but an ordinary afternoon at the pool transformed into something extraordinary. My dad, always the quiet, dependable presence in my life, was typically a distant figure. We swam together nearly every day that year, yet this particular time felt distinctly different. His gaze lingered on me, and the atmosphere between us crackled with an unspoken energy. It was as if I was truly seeing him for the first time, and a premonition of impending change settled upon me. The relentless summer heat was stifling, clinging to skin even in the shade, making everything feel sticky and unbearable. The pool became our sanctuary, a cool haven where we could escape the heat and the expectation of conversation. In the water, my dad seemed to transform. He moved with an effortless grace, as though the water was his natural element. He'd taught me everything I knew about swimming, from the fundamentals to complex strokes, but our interactions rarely extended beyond those lessons. The water seemed to grant us a silent reprieve, allowing us to simply coexist without the need for words. That pivotal day began like any other, the sun blazing mercilessly. Seeking relief, I grabbed my towel and headed towards the shimmering oasis of the pool in our backyard. My dad was already there, perched on the edge with his feet submerged, gazing at the horizon as if pondering something far beyond my comprehension. An invisible barrier always existed between us, a line neither of us dared to cross. But that day, a subtle shift occurred. I quietly entered the water, letting its coolness embrace me as I floated on my back, gazing at the clear sky. A comfortable silence settled between us until my dad spoke, his voice low and almost hesitant. "You've gotten better," he observed. "Your strokes, they're more controlled." The simple compliment, so rare from him, felt like significant praise. Unable to articulate a response, I simply nodded, aware of the water rippling around me. His gaze was palpable, but it wasn't the typical watchful eye of a parent. It felt different, more intense, inquisitive. An uncomfortable awareness grew within me, a sense of something changing between us, though I couldn't grasp what or why. The atmosphere felt thick with anticipation, as if we both awaited an unknown event. We continued our swim, laps back and forth, the silent distance between us still present yet noticeably diminished. Whatever barrier had existed was undeniably weakening. Then, a strange moment occurred. As I swam past, I felt his eyes linger, just a fraction longer than usual. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. When I glanced at him, his expression was unreadable, his face serene, yet his eyes held an inscrutable depth. In that instant, I understood. Things were irrevocably changing between us. The pool was no longer just a place to escape the heat. It had become a stage for something unforeseen. A confusing blend of intrigue and apprehension stirred within me. We remained in the pool longer than usual that day, swimming side by side, the water gently lapping against us. It wasn't the physical proximity that felt unusual, but the newfound emotional closeness, as if we were suddenly strangers. Floating in the silence, the tension between us was palpable, unspoken, yet heavy with meaning. The moment held a significance we both recognized, but were unwilling to acknowledge. We let the silence linger, knowing that whatever was unfolding was merely the beginning. The following days were filled with a strange new dynamic. An unspoken tension hung in the air, making the once comfortable silence feel heavy with meaning. Our daily swims continued, but each lap across the pool left me with more questions than answers. The oppressive heat intensified, making the pool our only refuge. In that cool blue world, things felt simultaneously familiar and alien. The pool was no longer just an escape from the heat. It had become the sole place where the invisible thread connecting us could stretch and twist, where I could attempt to decipher the unspoken language that had developed between us. Every time I caught him watching me, a knot of anticipation tightened in my stomach. The summer had become a crucible, forging a new and undefined relationship between us, one that held both excitement and trepidation. And yet, I didn't recoil. His gaze held an inexplicable magnetism, drawing me in. I had never considered my dad as anything other than just that. My dad. The man who assisted with homework, sat silently at dinner, whose approval I craved but rarely received. Yet in the pool, he was transformed. He was no longer simply my father. He was someone new, someone I felt compelled to understand, despite my uncertainty. The tension between us escalated gradually, like a pot simmering on the stove. It was evident in our conversations that abruptly halted before delving into anything meaningful, in our more deliberate movements around each other. Even his swimming style changed, less casual, more controlled, as if acutely aware of my every action, every ripple I created. One Friday afternoon, with the sun high overhead casting long shadows across the pool deck, I swam laps, pushing myself harder than usual to expend the nervous energy that had been accumulating all week. My dad sat by the edge, observing me, his silence more profound than usual, as if struggling to communicate without words. After my 10th lap, I paused, breathless, wiping water from my eyes. I glanced at him, anticipating a comment on my technique or perhaps a quiet word of praise. Instead, he simply met my gaze, and for the first time, I didn't avert my eyes. His gaze held an unnamed intensity that quickened my pulse and sent shivers down my spine despite the heat. For a moment, the world beyond the pool dissolved. It was just the two of us, the water lapping softly, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Breaking the silence, he rose and approached the pool with the same quiet confidence I'd always admired. He slid into the water beside me, the distance between us suddenly shrinking. I could feel the warmth radiating from him. Though we weren't touching, the space charged with anticipation. "You've been swimming hard," he finally said, his voice a low murmur. "You're really pushing yourself." I shrugged, feigning nonchalance, but my heart raced. Just trying to stay in shape, I guess. He nodded, but I sensed he sought a different answer. We floated for a moment, the water gently swaying us, neither of us speaking. Yet the silence was no longer empty. It was heavy with unspoken words. Then he spoke again, his voice softer. "You know, we don't talk much." It wasn't an accusation, merely an observation, but it resonated deeply. He was right. We rarely engaged in meaningful conversation. Our lives were defined by silence, by unspoken emotions. In that moment, the weight of all those years of quiet pressed down on us, demanding acknowledgement. "I know," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. I guess I never knew what to say. He smiled sadly, a smile that spoke of missed opportunities and unspoken regrets. "Me neither," he admitted. For a fleeting moment, I saw a vulnerability I'd never witnessed before. The tension between us vibrated through the water, making it hard to breathe. Without thinking, I moved closer, just enough to bridge the gap that had always separated us. He didn't retreat. He seemed to lean in almost imperceptibly, as if anticipating something, though nothing happened. Not yet. The rest of the day passed in a haze. We swam together. The silence between us transformed. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet we'd always known, but something akin to intimacy, though I couldn't quite grasp it. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the day at the pool, his gaze, the charged atmosphere. I tried to dismiss it as nothing, but deep down, I knew something had shifted between us, irrevocably. The next morning, I awoke feeling restless and anxious. The tension that had been building all week seemed to reach a crescendo. I tried to maintain my routine, but everything felt different. My thoughts kept returning to the pool, to his gaze, to the sensation of the cool, heavy water between us. As the sun began to set, I couldn't bear it any longer. I grabbed my towel and headed to the pool, hoping the water would soothe my inner turmoil. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at the edge just as he had the day before, his feet in the water, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For a moment, I considered turning back, pretending I hadn't seen him, but something compelled me forward, perhaps his pensive expression, or perhaps the unshakable feeling that whatever was happening between us wasn't over. My heart pounding, I stepped forward and slid into the water beside him. We floated in silence for what felt like hours, the setting sun painting the sky in vibrant hues. The moment felt pregnant with unspoken emotions, a silent acknowledgement of a shift in our relationship that neither of us fully understood. The tension between us was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Each glance at him sent my pulse racing, my breath catching in my throat. Yet I couldn't look away. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "There's something I need to tell you." My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure I was ready to hear what he had to say, but I nodded, unable to speak. He hesitated, searching for the right words. Then, his voice barely a whisper, he said, "I've been thinking a lot lately, about us, about how things have changed." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "What do you mean?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the truth in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted, "but something's different between us, and I don't think we can ignore it anymore." The air crackled with electricity, the water suddenly feeling too warm, too close. I wanted to speak, but words failed me. I simply nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. He said nothing more, and neither did I. As we floated side by side, I knew whatever was happening was only just beginning. The days that followed unfolded like a slow, rolling wave, pulling us deeper into something neither of us could explain. The very air between us felt different, charged with an unspoken understanding that we were no longer the same. The pool became our sanctuary, a place where the world faded, leaving only us and the quiet pull of the water. After that conversation, if it could even be called that, something shifted. I didn't know how to face him, yet I couldn't stay away. Every attempt to avoid the pool ended with my thoughts returning to him, his words, his eyes, the unspoken tension that hung between us like a secret we could no longer keep. It was a Thursday when it finally happened. The day began ordinarily, the sun blazing with an unbearable intensity. I spent the morning pacing, trying to distract myself, but the feeling that something was coming, something I wasn't ready for yet, couldn't stop, persisted. By mid-afternoon, I abandoned all pretense of normalcy. I grabbed my towel and headed outside, my heart already racing. I told myself it was just for a swim, to cool off, but I knew better. As expected, he was already at the pool, sitting on the edge with his feet in the water. But today, something was different. He seemed more relaxed, at peace, as if he'd come to terms with whatever had been brewing between us. I hesitated, watching him. He hadn't noticed me, his eyes lost in thought as he gazed at the rippling water. For a second, I considered leaving, but something drew me forward, an irresistible force. I slipped into the water quietly, the coolness enveloping me. For a few minutes, I simply floated, observing him. Finally he turned, and our eyes met. It was like a jolt of electricity. His gaze was different now, intense, focused, and for the first time, unguarded. He wasn't hiding, and neither was I. The air between us was heavy, almost suffocating, but I didn't want to escape. I wanted to delve deeper into whatever this was. We swam in silence, side by side but not touching, the water carrying us in slow circles. But the silence was different now, devoid of hesitation or confusion. It was charged with anticipation, a quiet understanding that something inevitable was about to occur. We eventually stopped in the shallow end, standing a few feet apart, the water lapping gently against us. The tension was almost unbearable, like a stretched rubber band about to snap. And then, without warning, it did. He moved toward me so quickly I barely reacted. His hand brushed my arm, a touch so light it could have been accidental, but it was deliberate, careful, as if testing the waters. Our eyes locked, and everything else vanished. The world outside the pool, the years of silence, the unspoken rules that had always separated us. We were left standing in the water, unable to resist the pull that had been building between us for weeks. He leaned in slowly, giving me a chance to stop him. But I didn't. My heart pounded, my breath coming in short gasps. He continued to close in until his lips finally brushed against mine. It was a soft, tentative touch, as if afraid to cross a point of no return. But the moment our lips connected, something inside me snapped. I couldn't hold back any longer. I kissed him back with a fervor that surprised us both. He couldn't either. The kiss deepened, the tension between us finally snapping as we surrendered to everything we'd held back. It began slowly, almost tentatively, but quickly escalated, becoming fierce, desperate. We were trying to reclaim all the lost time, all the unspoken words. His hands found my waist, drawing me closer, and I didn't resist. I couldn't. My hands gripped his shoulders, holding on as if terrified of letting go, terrified that if I did, the moment would vanish, and we'd revert. But deep down, I knew there was no going back. Not after this. We'd lost control. It was like a dam had burst, releasing everything we'd tried to suppress. The kiss grew more urgent, more passionate. Our bodies were molded together in the water, the world fading as we lost ourselves in each other. I didn't know how long we remained there, entangled, but it felt like forever, and a heartbeat simultaneously. I only knew I didn't want it to end, wanted to stay in this moment where nothing else mattered but him and me. Eventually we broke apart, both gasping for air, the water softly rippling around us. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of what had just transpired settling upon us. But there was no remorse in his eyes, no uncertainty, just the same quiet intensity that had always simmered beneath the surface. We didn't need words. His gaze told me everything. This wasn't a fleeting lapse, something that would disappear. It was real, something we both had to confront. We swam a while longer, the silence between us now comfortable yet charged with the knowledge of what had passed. There was no return. When we finally left the pool, the sun was setting, painting the water with a golden light. We wrapped ourselves in towels, saying little as we went inside. But the tension that had always hung between us was gone, replaced by something profound, something undeniable. That night, lying in bed, replaying everything, I realized this was just the beginning. Whatever had ignited in that pool wasn't over. It had just begun. The following days were unlike anything I'd experienced. After that moment, my life felt divided. The before, simple and predictable, and the after, where nothing felt certain. My thoughts were consumed by what had happened, and every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel his gaze, the warmth of his touch, the way the water had swept us into something irreversible. We avoided discussing it initially, as if pretending things were unchanged would make it so. But every encounter, every shared glance, every accidental brush in the house, the air crackled with unspoken understanding. We'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. Yet, despite the weight of it all, I couldn't regret it. It felt like I'd finally stumbled into something real, something I'd been yearning for unknowingly. The awkward dinners, the long silences, had given way to something deeper, but it wasn't easy. Doubt crept in at times, questioning if we'd made a mistake, if this was wrong. But those thoughts were fleeting. Every time I considered pulling away, every time I pictured returning to how things were, I realized I didn't want to. I couldn't go back to that emptiness. Soon, we found ourselves drawn back to the pool, as if it were the only place we could be truthful. It had always been our sanctuary, our escape, and now it was something more. A place where the lines blurred, where pretense was unnecessary. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, We were there again, the cool water against our skin, the sky ablaze with pink and gold. There was a tranquility in those moments, as if time had slowed, leaving us suspended in the stillness. Just the two of us. We didn't swim much that night. We floated in the shallow end, the silence comfortable, no longer strained. It felt different now, like we'd reached an understanding, an unspoken agreement that whatever this was didn't need explanation. It simply was. He spoke first, his voice low, hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon, the last sunlight glinting off the water. "About what happened." I nodded, my heart pounding. I'd been thinking about it too, constantly. But I didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate. They felt small, insufficient to express what had transpired between us. "I don't know how to explain it," he continued, his gaze finally meeting mine. "But I know I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." His words struck me harder than anticipated. There was a rawness, a vulnerability in his tone, and for the first time, I realized how deeply this had affected him as well. He wasn't just my dad anymore. He was someone I was beginning to understand on a profound level, someone I cared for beyond the roles we'd always played. "I don't want to lose you either," I replied softly, the words escaping before I could stop them. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the gentle lapping of water filling the silence. A strange tranquility washed over me, not the calmness of certainty, but of acceptance, of realizing that some things don't require explanation. They simply are. We remained there, suspended in the water, the silence no longer awkward, but peaceful, almost soothing. For the first time since this began, we'd found a balance, a way to navigate the complex emotions that had been building between us. But life, as always, reminded us that nothing is ever that simple. The next morning as I ate breakfast, my phone buzzed. A text from a friend I hadn't seen in weeks. "Pool party at Jenna's this weekend, you in?" I stared at the message, my mind racing. A pool party seemed so ordinary, so disconnected from everything that had happened between my dad and me. Yet it was a reminder that life outside the pool existed, that there were other people, other things waiting. I hadn't thought much about my friends since that night. It was like I'd been living in a separate world, one where only he and I mattered. But now, staring at the text, I realized I couldn't stay there forever. I looked up to see him watching me from the doorway. There was a question in his eyes, unspoken yet clear. "Are you going?" he asked finally, his voice cautious. "I don't know," I admitted, putting my phone down. "I haven't seen them in a while." He nodded, his expression unreadable. I felt the distance between us growing again, like a stretched rubber band about to snap. But this tension was different. Not the slow buildup of something inevitable, but the feeling of standing on a precipice, staring into the unknown. "I think you should go," he said quietly, meeting my gaze. "You need to be with your friends. You need a life outside of this." His words carried a weight that tightened my chest. He was right. I couldn't remain consumed by this forever. But the thought of leaving this newfound connection filled me with unexpected fear. "I don't want to leave this," I whispered. "You're not leaving anything," he said softly, stepping closer. "But you need to live your life. We both do." His calm, rational tone made it sound simple, but it wasn't. Nothing about this was simple. "I'll think about it," I said, knowing I couldn't avoid reality any longer. The next few days passed in a blur. I went to the party, saw my friends, tried to act normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. I drifted through conversations, my mind constantly returning to him, to the pool, to how everything had changed. When I got home that night, the house was quiet. I found him on the back porch, gazing at the pool, lost in thought. I watched him for a moment, realizing that no matter how hard we tried, things would never be the same. I stepped outside, joining him. We sat in silence, the pool shimmering in the moonlight, It felt like everything had come full circle, like we were back where we started, yet different, stronger, perhaps more honest. He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the water's soft glow. "It's not easy, is it?" I shook my head, a faint smile forming. "No, but I don't think it's supposed to be." We sat there for a long time, the silence heavy with everything that had happened, everything yet to come. In that moment, I realized that whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges we faced, we would face them together. No matter how complicated things had become, one thing was certain. We were in this together, for better or worse, and that was enough.